Hello, can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me? All right, excellent. Nice to meet you. I'm Chandler. Time's a ticking, so I'm just going to go ahead and hop on in. So today, topic nationalism is better than globalism. So we have to start by defining what nationalism and what globalism is in the sense that we're talking about here, because there's several definitions to each. So the globalism we're talking about today is the operation of planning of economic and foreign policy on a global basis, and nationalism planning economic and foreign policy with the host country in mind. Okay, there's several other definitions to nationalism. We won't get into those because that comes more to ideology than how the world is run as far as people's beliefs in the system. And so we have to dissect that further into applications because definitions are just simply definitions. If you look at the biggest application of globalism in the modern day world, that's going to be in IGOs, which are intergovernmental organizations, and the biggest example of those being the United Nations. And so the United Nations Charter describes them as maintaining peaceful operations and determining when they should deploy action. Now, the question comes to why that's more effective at maintaining peace as a governmental organization globally than nationalism on a national scale. Because since the UN was founded after World War II, we still have the same amount of proxy wars, crimes against humanity, crimes of war, and even genocide in places like Uganda, former Yugoslavia, and Myanmar. And so it begs the question on why globalism is any better than nationalism. Because if you look at the Westphalian system of nationalism, which most people believe to be the most productive and honestly the best, that ended the 30 Years' War, and I believe it was way back when they signed this treaty, it actually didn't cause that much devastation until it all blew up in the climax of World War I, which is a different time from now. And while you have UN and all these bodies, they're incredibly flawed, even in the way that they destabilize global economics policy and developing nations, as in they'll regulate nations with environmental restrictions when they're trying to become industrialized, or they'll send food and money to a nation and put all their farmers out of business and not allow nations to ever become self-dependent. I think it begs the question on why globalism is any better than nationalism at scale, because globalism, where you're looking out for everybody, is only relevant and necessary if nationalism is not in place. Because if every nation state is looking out for their own population, their own people, then there's no need for globalism. And I'll pass the mic to my opponent.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and agree to my opponent's definitions, but I'm going to disagree with his analysis that the biggest application of this is actually in intergovernmental organizations. Now, if you look at the definition that he provided, it's like the planning of economic and foreign policy on a global basis rather than a national basis. And I think the biggest application actually comes when countries themselves are choosing free trade over protectionism. Now, I'll offer a couple definitions after I'd like to institute one basic point of analysis, and that's the veil of ignorance. Now, what I'm suggesting here is that when we're using and deciding these kind of issues, these kind of questions, we should employ what John Rawls described as the veil of ignorance. That is the idea that when we're making decisions about what's fair and just, we need to be assuming not that we're Americans or Bosnians or anything like that. We need to be assuming that we could be anybody. And we should be looking at this as the kind of idea of what's best for anybody and what's best for everybody as a whole. And the simple truth is that globalism is far better for everyone or every citizen than nationalism is. Let's talk about economics. I'll talk about some other things in a little bit, but let's start out by talking about economics. Now, I have 3 points on why globalism is far better economically than nationalism. Now, the major aspects, the major manifestations of globalism and nationalism are free trade and protectionism in these cases. Protectionism says that we're going to protect a country's domestic industry and use our power to make sure that this domestic industry is doing well. And globalism says we're going to use free trade and we're going to make sure that we're trading all across nations. We're not seeing a big difference in national borders here. So we see that first, it's more efficient. Adam Smith described this as the process of comparative advantage. The idea that some nations are better at producing something than other nations are. And so when we put these restrictions on trade for the sake of, I guess, promoting our national industry, we often end up harming and making our whole process less efficient. Secondly, it's less expensive. Now, sorry, okay, that's weird. My notes just failed to load. But sorry about that, but here. Okay, so according to the Cato Institute, global trade liberalization through the WTO and other efforts generated between $2,800 and $5,000 in additional income for the average American, and between $7,100 and $12,900 for the average household. Now, there's lots more statistics that I'm planning on bringing up, but the data is pretty clear. When you focus planning on your economy on a global basis rather than a national basis, people, regardless of where they are going to be better off.
Excellent. I absolutely agree that trading is important with the law of comparative advantage and absolute advantage. But I think the key thing that my opponent is missing is the difference between nationalism and isolationism. Isolationism is the belief that we should remain to ourselves, not get involved in foreign affairs, and therefore limit trade. Nationalism is simply putting your country's priority above that of a global perspective, which isn't necessarily a negative thing, even though it does have this negative connotation affiliated with it. Many, like the Westphalian Nationalist Society, they just believe they have their own sovereignty, but they actually don't want to restrict trade that much. Now, you did bring up an interesting point. There is the use of different trade barriers so that we can protect domestic producers, because in the interest of our own country and our own GDP in any country in the world, you always want the economic success by limiting other outlying factors that you can't control within your own borders. So, for example, if I'm a producer in America and I can only make t-shirts at a certain price because of minimum wage and our regulations in America, it's not necessarily fair for a country like China that has child labor to be able to just import all these cheap goods into my country. Now, to add on to that, globalism is not always in favor of economic development. Like I stated before, in countries like in Africa, where there's these countries trying to develop and become industrialized, and globalisms and IGOs like the UN puts regulations on them so they are not able to become industrialized, whether it's through environmental regulations or just regulating the T&Cs that try and get into the country. It's just not as pro-economic in a bunch of these large global organisms as it may seem. You also have to think who's leading all these IGOs. Specifically, the UN is led by 5 major members on the Permanent Security Council, which lacks representation from both South America and Africa. But they have ultimate say over everything that the UN does, including everything from their economic policies to where they should put troops and assistance to where they should send food to aid humanitarian needs. And that's just very biased and flawed, in my personal opinion, when there's not a single representative from 2 different continents. So I think it's just not a very good system, especially when they can inflict upon the sovereignty of those nations. This always comes down to an issue of a nation-state sovereignty. And it's impossible to have a globalism and a global society without infringing on a nation-state sovereignty. Very rare exceptions, this is acceptable, like the Genocide Convention, where it signs non-actors and both signatories and non-signatories. And that's the other major issue with globalism, is how do you influence the people who aren't a part of these NGOs and all these people that leave or that are non-signatories. And it's a flawed issue with all NGOs and globalism as a whole. And with that, I'll pass the mic to my opponent.
Okay, so I'm going to start out by talking about the entire argument that I'm making. And this whole idea is that these global organizations are flawed. This idea is these IGOs are flawed. Now, our response is going to be philosophy versus implementation. Now, when we're talking about globalism versus nationalism, we're talking about 2 different philosophies. The problem is my opponent is confusing the philosophy with the implementation of the philosophy. And what he's saying there is that because the implementation has been poor in these cases, that we should reject the philosophy behind it. That's a flawed way of thinking about this whole discussion. We need to be thinking about the philosophy itself and then analyzing the implementation of it. So when he talks about how the UN is a flawed system, yeah, the UN has some problems. Now, I think that on the whole, the UN has been a pretty good organization, but it definitely has its problems. But we should not be rejecting it and the whole philosophy behind globalism simply because the UN is flawed in some cases. Let's look now back at the trading argument. So my opponent starts out by talking about how there's the difference between isolationism and nationalism. Now, what I'm talking about here is not the idea of isolationism. That's not what I'm accusing my opponent of upholding. Instead, I'm talking about protectionist policies, which he actually said were a pretty good thing during his speech. He actually suggested we do have protectionist policies in place. Now, the problem with these whole policies is that according to James Boyard, in the National Center for Policy Analysis, tariffs and quotas cost consumers $80 billion per year, about $800 for each American family. These are the kind of things we have in the US, which are very low tariff barriers compared to many other countries in the world. These are the kind of things that you'd see in a protectionist society. When we liberalized our trade, we gained about $2,500 to $5,000 per American. And even now, in place, we have policies that are costing Americans $800 a year per family. So what he's talking about here, what he's actually bringing up and suggesting we do, is going to cost the average person just in America a whole ton of money. So that's part of the problem here. He's suggesting this policy that's going to hurt the average American and the average person in general. So let's now look at one other point he made, which is the fact that globalism is going to harm economic development. Now, this simply is not the case. If we look at the World Bank study, the World Bank studied the whole idea of which countries are going to be more globalized or which ones are focusing more on nationalism. And they found that of developing countries that are choosing to be integrated and choosing to be more globalized, they had higher income growth, longer life expectancy, and better schooling. Per capita in these countries grew by an average of 5%. The real wages increased and the number of poor people fell. I think that's a pretty clear case that globalism actually does improve economic development. I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic.
Excellent. And I do understand that there are benefits to globalism as well. I don't think anybody can argue that. Both systems are just a different way of trying to achieve the thing. So the first thing that my opponent said is that everybody in America would benefit if we were able to get rid of these trade barriers. And I'd have to say that's just not true. Statistically speaking, yes, you can take the number and divide it by the amount of citizens in America. That's just not how the math actually works out. If you look at the numbers specifically, you'll see that if we take rid of these barriers, we'll undermine a lot of American businesses and not give incentives for companies to stay in America. We saw that a long time ago with stuff like NAFTA, where a bunch of companies went to Mexico and Canada, because there was no incentive to stay in America. And I think that would once again become a problem. And then he also argued the philosophy over implementation. We are human, so I believe implementation is very important. It shouldn't just be dismissed because we are flawed individuals. But even if you look at the Westphalian system of nationalism, that was eventually dismissed World War I with the establishment of the League of Nations. But if you look at it, the system actually had some very good points philosophically, but it was still dismissed just because of the implementation. So I think it's unfair to treat that system of nationalism in one way and particularly pick on it due to its implementation and not look at something like the UN and the modern adaptation of globalism the same way. Now, when you look at the Westphalian system of sovereignty and of nationalism, it just basically gives each nation the right to have domestic control over what happens within their borders. And it also gives them protection through alliances rather than signing some treaty or some agreement somewhere that's supposed to protect them that doesn't really have the power to back it up. We see time and time again these countries and IGOs that just get cornered into a wall, and that provokes them to outrageous actions, such as we're currently seeing with North Korea, where we give them economic sanctions and they feel like they have no choice but to respond violently, which causes civil unrest and also kind of upheavals the socioeconomic status of all these countries in the world when they have to impose economic sanctions on a specific country just because something like the UN is bullying them into that specific corner. Now, if you continue to look at the Westphalian system that I keep talking about, the reason it failed back then is because empires went to war with each other and they wanted to test out their equipment and conquer each other. But now that's not the case, as we saw with like the proxy wars in Vietnam and Korea. The U.S. is never going to go to war with Russia like, they would have during World War I, for example, around that era, because we have mutually assured destruction now. And so we find safety nowadays in alliances with one another. And we also know that we cannot go into a full-out war with one another. So there's more incentive to not go to war with one another, even though war does create economic benefit. But in the end, I just believe that Westphalian nationalism is the ultimate key to success due to the fact that it promotes better economic standing in itself and for its own domestic people.
Okay, so let's talk again about the whole idea of economics. Now, I think, as I said earlier, that economics is the most important issue in this round because the average person is regularly going to interact with the benefits from globalism or the cost of nationalism based on economics. That's just how it works. Now, economics is something that's going to affect just about everyone in the world. And so when we're talking about economics, we're talking about decisions that people make every day. And so that's why I think this is the most important issue in this round. So let's talk about the economic thing. So my opponent says that they're basically, people are going to lose from globalist policies, that they're going to be losers from that. We're not going to give them incentives to keep American jobs in place. Now, what I'm saying here is not that there aren't going to be anybody who's going to suffer at all from globalism. I'm saying that everyone benefits from globalism because of the greater amount of efficiency. That means that prices are going to be lower. There's going to be more products available. Now, I actually see, as I pointed out earlier, the fact that it benefits developing countries specifically. It causes poverty to go down when countries are more globalized. It causes per capita income to rise. That's in contrast to nations that are less globalized. So what I'm talking about here is the fact that it really does benefit everyone. Sure, it has some costs, but in the long run, what you're talking about are enormous benefits compared to the costs. Now, my opponent brings up NAFTA really quickly, and so I'm going to quickly address that. Now, according to the Peterson Institute of International Economics, NAFTA only cost on net about 15,000 US jobs. And for every one of those jobs that was lost, it brought in about $400,000 to $500,000 to the US economy. So yeah, it sucks that you lose your job, but it also created jobs and brought thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars for every job that was lost. So talking about NAFTA as some kind of enormous failure that harmed a bunch of people is simply flawed. NAFTA, although it has some issues, is on the whole an extremely beneficial system for America. So my opponent keeps going back to this whole idea of the Westphalian system and how it's going to be better economically and how it's going to be better for national security and all that. Now, I've already explained why economics is really the most important issue in the round, but I'm going to go ahead and respond to this point. Now, he said that economically the Westphalian system is going to work. My response is no statistics. He's given you absolutely no empirics to prove that the Westphalian system is any better than the globalized system. In fact, when we look at the national protectionist policies that I've discussed, I've seen that the statistics really fall and prove that globalism is far better than nationalism. And so I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic back.
Absolutely. And I agree. I'm an economics major. I absolutely agree that economics is a very important thing in our day-to-day life. You keep talking about how getting rid of these trade barriers would benefit the average consumer, and having these trade barriers up costs the average consumer money in a country like America or any country in the world. But I have to say that that's not necessarily the case. So if you look at how you measure a country's growth, there's a few ways to do it. You can use the real GDP, the nominal GDP, or my personal favorite is the GDP to debt ratio. Now, when you have a significant amount of imports into your country, imports are negatively represented in the GDP equation. And so that actually in some way tarnishes a country's economic growth on the end. Also, most things in an economy, as far as getting rid of trade barriers and having influx of imported goods, are fairly temporary in how they actually affect the economy and supply demand, because the economy is naturally going to shift in waves with the absence of monetary and fiscal policy. Now, I'll continue on to say that your statistics about NAFTA. So from what I'm reading, I believe you mentioned 15,000 jobs were lost in NAFTA, if I'm correct. My statistics quote a much bigger number than that, so I apologize if I misheard you, but I think we'll have to agree to disagree on that one. If you go to the National Bureau of Statistics, U.S. Department of Statistics, you can able to see that over hundreds of thousands of jobs were lost due to NAFTA and these loss of tax incentives. And so you have to look at it from a scale of, is it worth putting the average U.S. or any domestic consumer out of business just to support, or I'm sorry, producer out of business just to support the average consumer in that country? Now, all this comes in trade and balances. If you look at how countries hand out tariffs and taxes on specific goods, you have to look that no country just does it randomly. They do it for a specific reason to help a failing or declining industry. And then in response, the other country that is getting taxed is also going to put another tariff or tax on one of their goods. It's always a game of checks and balances to always try and benefit the nation, as we talked about in comparative and absolute advantages in the laws that abide to economics in that sense. And so I don't think nationalism having these trade barriers is necessarily a bad thing. I think free trade supports an unhealthy marketplace and also hurts domestic producers in whatever given country anywhere in the world. Not only that, but globalism, like IGOs, I've said time and time again, hurts developed countries. Your statistics mainly point out countries that are already developed, like the US, and countries like Africa that are limited by such regulations are not able to become industrial and developed. And so that hurts those countries in the world just as much as it hurts countries like the US. And I'll pass it back to my opponent on that note.
So there are four major arguments that my opponent brought up. First, he talked about the whole idea of measuring wealth and said that imports and globalism is going to cause, like, it's going to harm the people involved. It's going to harm our wealth of a nation. Now, my response is that of the empirics. Now, if we look at the empirics involved in this, we see that it actually benefits the nation. Protectionist policies cost us $80 billion a year, as I already quoted, and that's $800 per American family. That's a big issue. The statistically show that protectionism is going to harm American consumers. Secondly, he talked about how there were jobs lost to NAFTA. And I apologize if this became a little bit confusing. I was talking about the 15,000 net jobs lost to NAFTA. So we had hundreds of thousands jobs lost to NAFTA, but hundreds of thousands more that came about as a result of NAFTA. And according to the Peterson Institute of International Economics, they were largely higher paying and more beneficial jobs for Americans. So then he talks about how trade is like a system of checks and balances, and how ultimately free trade creates this unhealthy market. And we need to have this kind of nationalist policy where countries are putting protectionist tariffs on one side, and then we're doing that on the other side too. Now, my response is that of nations versus citizens. Now, nations can do this all they want, and maybe it would benefit the nation, maybe it'll benefit their domestic industry, but it's going to harm the citizens within the nation. When we adopt the veil of ignorance and ask ourselves, what's it going to be like if we were a citizen of any average nation? What's clear from the empirics that I provided is that it's better for the average citizen, any random citizen of the world, to have a globalist society. Now I'm going to go back to this whole point when I talk about his fourth response, which is the idea that it only benefits developed nations. Now he says in response to this whole argument that globalism is only going to benefit developed nations. And I've only brought up examples from developed nations like America. My response is I have actually brought up examples from developing nations. A World Bank study I brought up tells us, in fact, that developing nations which become more globalized are actually far more likely and do far better than nations that don't. They were talking about a 5% increase in GDP per capita. Real wages in these countries rose and the number of poor people fell. They have higher growth, longer life expectancy, and better schooling. So very clearly, what I've proven here with this empirics is that it doesn't only benefit developed nations, though it certainly does so. It also benefits developing nations. And so when we look at the whole cost-benefit analysis here, what I believe is very clear from what I've shown is that empirically it's going to be far better for your average random citizen of the world to have a globalist society than a nationalist. I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic.
Yes, and I understand where my opponent's from as far as some of those points, but I have to say that we are going to have to just agree to disagree on the sense that it's going to benefit everyone inside a country like America or whatever country if there's free trade. I personally can show statistics and how you actually pull out the GDP formula that having no trade restrictions is going to negatively impact both your GDP, real GDP, and your GDP to debt ratio. That's just how the equation works out. Mathematically, since imports are negatively represented in the equation. Now, if you continue that on, you said that it's going to benefit everyone in every country in the world if everybody if the whole world is globalized. And that's just not the case. If you look at countries that are still trying to develop, as I alluded to earlier, they aren't able to because of environment policies that are impacted by these, IGOs. It's a system where bigger countries are able to dictate the pace at which the globe runs by, as you can see with the P5 on the United Nations Permanent Security Council. And if you just continue to look at all these countries in the world, it's very difficult to say that globalism since World War II, back when this was established, has actually made any efforts to increase society since then compared to nationalism since the Treaty of Westphalia. Since the Treaty of Westphalia, there was a significant decrease in times of war. Peace was actually pretty common back in those days. And also the economics of most nations in the world, their economies increased significantly. Now, if you look at the modern day, we have rapid inflation in some countries like Zimbabwe that is out of hand, that the United Nations and other IGOs aren't really able to impact. You have other nations, like even in the US, that have significant economic problems with our debts reaching about 20 trillion. And there's just not a way that we can do this on a global scale without nationalism to look out for ourselves and implement economic policies that benefit ourselves as well. Now, trading and working with other countries is absolutely a necessity, like we talked about earlier, and we agreed on the law of comparative and absolute advantages. But it's just not a reality in the world we live in, since we are humans and we are flawed individuals. You argue this is an issue of the philosophy. I argue this is an issue of implementation. And I just don't see substantial evidence that globalism, since back in after post-World War II, has been able to achieve the goals that it set out to do. Since we're right now in quite socioeconomic unrest in most countries, some countries still are unable to be developed when countries like the United States have for a very long time. And just so many countries are still just not quite on the global stage, where it's not equally representing them. Like I said, there's nobody in Africa or South America that's even on the Security Council. And with that, I'll pass the mic back to my opponent.
Okay. So at the end of this round, like this is just about my last speech. So I'm going to focus on the big issues that have been brought up. Now, we've been talking primarily about economics because that's what I said we really need to be focusing on. Like, we've agreed that economics is going to be something that's going to benefit and it's going to be important to every citizen. So when we look at economically, the simple fact is that globalism is far better than nationalism is. So let's talk about a little bit about why. Now, my opponent talked first about how globalism is going to harm GDP and how it's going to cause our GDP to go down. My response is statistics versus citizens. When we're talking about what's going to happen, what's going to be best for people as a general body, when we're talking about the veil of ignorance, we don't care about the GDP or what happens. We care about what's going to happen to the citizens involved. And the citizens involved, as I've demonstrated through the empirics, are far better off under a globalist society. He then talked more about the whole idea of philosophy versus implementation and how the UN system is really bad because of the Security Council and the Permanent Five. Again, my response is just to be philosophy versus implementation. We don't reject the philosophy of justice because courts sometimes get it wrong. We shouldn't reject the philosophy of globalism because the UN has some flaws as an organizational structure. He then talked about how the Treaty of Westphalia and that kind of national system led to a lot of economic growth, and we don't have that in the globalist society. My response is that's completely false. We see that across the 20th century, since we've actually had more of a globalist society, as we become more globalized, we've seen absolute poverty fall drastically. We've seen absolute poverty go way down as we become more of a globalized society. That's just the simple facts of the matter. We've seen absolute poverty fall, and that's an enormous, enormous boon to the world. So when we look at the end of this round, I'd like you to remember one thing, people who are making this decision, judges, all that. What's really important is what's really important for the average person involved. The average poor person from Myanmar, or the poor farmer from Mexico, or the poor farmer or industrial worker from Brazil. And what we've seen from the empirics involved is that those people are far better off when we're choosing globalism. I provided empirics and my opponent hasn't. He hasn't provided you with any statistics about how nationalism is better. I provided you with plenty of them. I've talked about developing nations, I've talked about America, and I've shown you that globalism is going to benefit everyone. Even if there are going to be some costs, on balance, it's going to be a far better system than nationalism is. I'm passing the mic.
I believe this all comes down to simply how you choose to represent the people of the world and how they work out. If you look at the Gallup World Poll, it shows that the dissatisfaction with the standard of living has risen in recent years. Even though GDP per capita is rising, dissatisfaction is also rising with it, which is rather odd and something we haven't experienced before in history. Now, once again, you talk about philosophy versus implementation. I believe that as flawed humans, implementation is the only thing we're ever going to be able to achieve. And philosophically, we can look at it, but that doesn't mean much.
Okay, so at the end of this round, this is my last speech. So let's talk about the two big issues. That's that of philosophy versus implementation and economics. Now, when we talk about philosophy versus implementation, well, my point here is that we don't make decisions, we don't throw out a philosophy because it's implemented poorly. We have to ask our questions, is the philosophy itself bad? As I've shown from the statistics and from the logic involved, globalism does work. There have been some poor implementation within the UN. We see much better implementation in organizations like the WTO or the EU. But yeah, the UN is flawed, but that doesn't mean we should throw out globalism, especially when it has the kind of economic benefits that I'm talking about here. Now, I've provided you, again, with plenty of statistics. I've shown you that it's going to improve life in developing countries. Far more globalized countries do far better than nationalized countries. in terms of their just GDP and their impact on poor people and just people in general. Same thing with America. So at the end of the day, when we're asking, what are we doing? When we're stepping behind the veil of ignorance and making this decision, I believe it's very clear that if we're going to be making this decision properly and fairly,